Well, good morning. My name is Michael Lenox. I'm one of the senior fellows here at the Miller Center, and it is an absolute pleasure to have with me today Todd Stern. Todd is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and also a distinguished fellow at the Asia Society, and he is the author of the new book, Landing the Paris Climate Agreement, which talks about his experience as the chief climate negotiator in the Obama administration and his efforts to bring about the Paris Accords. We're going to run this as a fireside chat. I'm going to be asking Todd some questions, exploring some of the themes in the book, but we will also have an opportunity for you to share questions that you may have. For those in the room, we ask you to do so by just filling out the cards that are around the room here. And for those of you online, you can submit those online, and we're going to feed those through me. So Todd, a pleasure to have you with us here today. I want to start with some history to begin with. Your first experiences kind of in the climate change world go all the way back to the Clinton administration and your work there with the Kyoto Conference back in the early 1990s. So I'd be curious, just looking back on that time period, who were the major players and what were the major themes in that kind of early stages of your involvement?
Well, so I got pulled into climate change in 1997. I was in the Clinton White House. I was doing completely different things, minding my own business. And in around July of 97, the chief of staff came and asked me if I could jump in and help on climate change, preparing for a big conference that was coming up in Kyoto, Japan. In December, and so that was when I just started to kind of get my feet wet. The issue then, interestingly, was, so you can go back to the original climate change treaty, which was in 1992. It's called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in pretty short order, countries in the world decided, within a year or two really, that that's a good start. But that was very broad. That wasn't, it didn't have much meat on the bones, and that there needed to be an operational treaty that did more to tell countries what they really needed to do and so forth. So that gave rise to a mandate for a new negotiation. The mandate happened in 1995, and the negotiation was supposed to end in Kyoto. And it turned out there were lots of things wrong with what happened in Kyoto. I was there. Again, but as a kind of newbie. But that effort to get an operational agreement that was really going to bring the Framework Convention to life and go beyond it, actually, started all the way back then. And that's what Paris eventually got done, 20 years later.
So a very long negotiation.
Yeah, well, sort of ups and downs, like Kyoto got done, and then Kyoto failed for various reasons. And then there was another effort in 2009, which was, I would argue, very useful, but it didn't produce the big treaty that people had been hoping for. So all of these trying, failing, and then finally trying and succeeding in Paris.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about that. So let's fast forward to 2009. Now you're with the Obama administration, chief climate negotiator. We have COP15 in Copenhagen coming about. And China now is a major player and negotiating partner here. And you talk quite a bit about the book about your relationship and work and engagements with Minister Xi from China. So can you tell us a little bit, at that moment, where was China? What was the relationship like, those negotiations?
Yeah, so I'm going to get right to China, but just a little bit of background. The thing that failed about Kyoto, it failed most importantly because the United States, which said yes in Kyoto, the negotiating team said yes to what was produced, but there was actually no chance in hell that agreement could be approved by the U.S. Senate, and it was the kind of agreement, many international agreements are not like this, but it was the kind of agreement that required under the Constitution a 2/3 vote of approval by the Senate. And there was a basic paradigm that was embodied in the Kyoto document, which was that, first of all, developed and developing countries were in completely separate categories, what people in the negotiations came to call a firewall. And all of the responsibilities, all of the requirements that were set forth in Kyoto were for developed countries and nothing for developing countries. And quite rigorous items called for for developed countries. So that was a complete non-starter in the United States. I mean, I used to say to my team, if you took the Declaration of Independence and whited out the top and said climate change, you couldn't get the votes for it in the, in the Senate back then. Probably not now either. So if there was one conviction that I had when I came in with President Obama at the beginning of 2009 was we would not do say yes to an agreement that we then wouldn't be able to join. That paradigm, which so this is now 12 years later, the paradigm was still there. Yeah. And what I knew was we had to change that paradigm. And I brought this piece of paper up because it's got a quote on it that I like. That happened. The quote happened in 2016. So after all the shooting was over and Paris had happened and all of that was good, I came across a quote from Henry Kissinger in an Atlantic magazine article, in which he said, "The fundamental strategic question is, what is it that we will not permit? And the second question is, what are we trying to achieve?" And I thought, that's kind of like what was going on with us, right? What we could not permit was the kind of agreement that happened in Kyoto. What we were trying to achieve was a whole lot of positive things, but we had to not have that kind of structure. So China, look, by 2009, China was already the biggest emitter in the world. It's now twice the size of the U.S. and bigger than all developed countries in the world put together. I mean, China is 30% now. Not that it wasn't that much in 2009, but still very big. So China was going to be key. And I met early with my counterpart in March of 2009, Xi Jinping, and he's sort of a through line. The relationship that we had was a kind of a through line through the whole book. But we met in March of 2009 in Washington, and I said to him right away that, you and I ought to try to make climate change a positive pillar in this relationship, which was stressed in all sorts of ways. Not as stressed as it is now, but still very stressed. I mean, there were very few issues where we weren't knocking heads. And climate change had been one of those issues we were knocking heads on in the past. So he listened. He didn't say yes or no, but we sort of got started. And he's a terrific guy who we got to be quite good friends. But in that first year, we were already good friends, getting to be very good friends. But China was not yielding at all, and we kind of came to blows by the time we got to Copenhagen.
How are they looking at the issue? I mean, clearly in the the decade plus that has transpired, they've made huge investments to make a transition here. Was that evident back then, or was there a different way they were thinking about this issue?
Well, it wasn't not nearly as evident. I mean, what has happened with respect to the whole development of clean energy, the whole green transition, if you will, over the last years, and certainly going all the way back to 2009, has been absolutely amazing, and China has played a big part in that. But no, they weren't. Things were not as advanced back in 2009 in that regard. China was obsessed with keeping the structure, keeping that firewall completely in place, and the thing that's always been crazy about that division of countries, not the division of countries itself, which was laid out in the 1992 agreement, but that it was always interpreted as being locked in place. Like, so these are the developing countries in 1992. Well, it's okay, so now we're 30 years later, same ones. And China says to this day, you can't expect us to do the same thing. Although Paris changed that a lot, but China in 2009, and even today, you'll see China talking about their developing country status, even though they're the second biggest economy in the world and kind of bound and determined to be the #1 economy in the highest tech, most advanced technology. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but they love that. They love to hang on to that.
You know, another developing economy that features prominently in the book is India.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, again, more around the 2009 period? Where was India in the negotiations? What was their stance?
So India was quite fascinating, actually. I came into the job thinking that India would sort of be old line, strict firewall kind of approach, and half of India was, and half of India wasn't, in terms of obviously not the people that I'm talking about, but there were two different important players in 2009, and the first one was his name is Sham Saran, and he was old school, and an advisor to the prime minister, and he would not vary at all from the from that kind of firewall approach, and even the sort of an approach that went back in other ways all the way to the 1970s or so. And he lectured you, and he was just out of central casting. Mm-hmm. And then I go for the first time to India with Secretary Clinton in, I think it was June, in the summer, and met for the first time Jairam Ramesh, who was the Minister for Environment and Forestry there, and he's a completely different character, and it turned out just a fascinating guy who wanted to push India in a more progressive direction, thought it would be best for India, had to do this while also, kind of balancing on the balance beam, keeping China and others in their kind of cohort adequately sort of on board, but in the meantime working with us to find a way forward. And he was just enormously important. What we got done in 2009, I'd say he was one of the most important people in the world in letting us get as far as we did.
Now, in your book, this period from like 2009 up to the Paris conference, you use the title "Creative Destruction," which you're speaking my language. This is kind of where I view myself. This is in reference to Joseph Schumpeter, a famous economist, who talked about the gales of creative destruction. I'm curious, why the use of that term during this phase? What was the creative destruction?
The creative destruction was really, I used that as the title, really for 2009, which was such a kind of tumultuous, chaotic, incredible year in terms of climate negotiations, that I actually spend the first 3 chapters out of 10 talking about 2009, and the first 2 lead up to the actual COP, the actual convention itself, and it was. The result of 2009 of the Copenhagen conference was such that it was just pilloried all over the world as a disaster, a failure, and to this day, you'll probably hear most people who are climate people around the world still looking at it that way. Maybe they'll look at it a little less that way after they read my book, but in the U.S., we came away immediately thinking that it had been, as I said, chaotic, tumultuous, mind-bending, but that important things had been done to start chipping away at that firewall in a way that would be constructive and in a way that hopefully would open doors going forward. So I don't think we knew this at the time. We didn't know that Paris was coming at that time, but it planted seeds that ultimately, over a 7-year period, bore fruit. And so creative destruction was the destruction was at one level Copenhagen, and the creativity was in what came out of Copenhagen, which was a 2.5-page agreement that came together in the last 24, 36 hours, when for the first time ever, world leaders had been invited. The Danes had done that for a very deliberate reason. I mean, completely risky thing to do. But I think they got a lot of, to me, they get a lot of credit for having the nerve to do that. And, you know, the leaders came, and in that last, you know, Obama was there, I think maybe 18 hours. Hillary Clinton was there a little longer, but put together something that put together that 2.5-page agreement. And so that was the creative part, and the crashing of the conference was the destructive part. But it just felt, I mean, I knew, I'm not a big reader of Schumpeter, but I know the phrase and I know the idea, and I thought it just sort of fit.
Yeah, and I love that idea that to be able to kind of shift the narrative and change the way people were looking at the negotiations, you needed this chaotic moment to do so.
I think so, and I say it in the book at one point, little double entendre, that I think it's one of the very last paragraphs of that 3-chapter focus on 2009, which is you can't. What did I say? You can't change a paradigm without breaking some china.
To be careful with that,
which definitely had a double meaning.
Yeah. All right, so let's fast forward now to 2015, the actual Paris conference. If you get a chance to read the book, and I highly recommend it, it is. I'm waiting for the movie to be made of like the Paris negotiations. It's going.
Well, I've got something to say about that.
Okay, have you got the rights to that?
There's actually something. There's something going on about that.
All right, well, I'll let you comment in a second. We don't have enough time to kind of go through all of the wild swings of what was happening, but I'd love to hear a couple of the moments actually when you thought it was over, like where you just weren't going to get there, and then kind of what happened to bring it back again.
I don't think I ever thought it wasn't going to happen.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that. I mean, there was a million times that things were like somewhat off the rails, but I sort of always kind of had in mind. I remember when I worked in the Clinton White House, and my initial boss was John Podesta, and he said to me at some point that Bill Clinton would just not stop. I mean, he wouldn't, if you think about a football field, he wouldn't be able to run straight down the field, but he'd go here and loop around, and he just wouldn't stop. He just would keep going. So that was kind of the metaphor that was always in, like, stuff got screwed up here or there, but it was like, I pretty much was always like, what do we do? Not like, it's not going to happen. The thing that I would say, there's conferences every year. There was, without going into all the detail, you had Copenhagen, as we talked about. It ended up with this short agreement, which was not fully adopted, because the thing that I haven't told you about yet is that the decision-making process in the climate change negotiations is that decisions have to be made by consensus, which means basically everybody has to agree, and the everybody is 195 countries who have their own priorities, who are in their own various different blocks and groups. So it's a dive with a high degree of difficulty, for sure. And but so we got where we got in Copenhagen. 2 years later, there was a conference that produced a new mandate. Okay, so I think Copenhagen was better than people thought, but it certainly wasn't the big new agreement that we needed, not yet. So then a new mandate's negotiated for 4 years, which turned out to be the Paris conference. So that year, 2011, was really important. There's bit by bit progress year by year. 2014, John Kerry was the Secretary of State then, and he called me up in January to his office, and it's a big fireplace. He's got his dog there. It's and he said, well, you know, we had a really good year with China, with some important stuff that happened in 2013. It was the first year of Xi Jinping. Obama met with him. There was some good climate stuff came out of it. Kerry did some good things. So it was a good year. He said, basically, what are we going to do for an encore? We have to keep it going with China. So I said, I'll come back tomorrow. Let me go talk to my team. We'll come up with something. So what we came up with was, and it was my chief of staff came up with the idea to, what if the US and China, we knew the two presidents were going to be together in Beijing in November. What if the two countries could agree together to announce their proposed emission reductions, their targets, in this new agreement that was supposed to get done in Paris 1 year later, so in 2015. So I initially thought that there was no chance of that because I thought China wouldn't want to get kind of on the wrong side of their allies who wouldn't have wanted that. Wouldn't have wanted to see China getting close with the U.S. in that way. But within about a minute, I thought, the Chinese might look at this at a different level, at a level up above climate change, at a broader level of the U.S.-China relationship, as being a really good thing for the two countries, a good thing for what Xi Jinping wanted. His mantra at that time was a new form of great power relations. And so, in any event, they bought it. And what started then was a 10-month secret negotiation between the U.S. and China to see if we could pull this off. We didn't know, it had to be secret because we couldn't be sure that we would go ahead with it if in October, let's say, when China says, okay, here's our numbers, here's what we're going to, and if the numbers were weak and ineffectual, we couldn't have President Obama walking down the aisle with Xi Jinping, and basically embracing him. So we had to wait till we could see what their numbers were before it was really a go. Ergo, it had to be kept secret, and somehow it actually didn't leak the whole year. So the thing happened, that agreement, the so-called U.S.-China joint announcement in November of 2014, and in the climate change world, completely electrifying, because all the countries on the developing countries side, looking at China as their lead, thought, oh my God, this thing that we've been trying to do for 20 years, instead of like, well, it'll fall apart in the end, it's like, the U.S. and China, the two 800-pound gorillas, have agreed. And not just did they announce, it was announcing what our targets were going to be, but it was also like about a 4-page statement, which was very positive, which said the two presidents wanted to get this done. They'd work together to overcome any obstacles. It was really a forward-looking. And so people all over the world, climate negotiators and presidents and ministers thought this was really going to get done. So this was a huge jolt of kind of positive energy, which still didn't mean that Paris was going to get done. I think what was true when we actually went to Paris, I thought there's going to be an agreement. But there's a big difference between an agreement and a good agreement, right? So you could have an agreement that was kind of minimalist, that didn't do that much, and there were quite a few countries who wanted that. China would have been happier with a more minimalist agreement than we were, and than many other players. So I thought it was going to get done, but I really, really did not know if we were going to get it done the way we wanted to get it done. And the thing that was quite remarkable by the time it was all over, on account of all sorts of many countries playing huge roles, the EU, the Europeans were very important. There was a large group of poor countries, island countries, very vulnerable countries, that joined together with Europe, the US, Japan, Australia, others, to create something that came to be known as the High Ambition Coalition, ambition in terms of doing a lot on climate. And all of those factors came together to eventually get it done, combined with the tremendous skill of the French in managing. So they were the president of the conference that year, and the French have a long and an impressive history of diplomacy and of being able to do that kind of thing. And they were just great. Yeah. So you just had a lot of factors that came together. And I think most people, most countries left Paris feeling that the outcome was better than their best case scenario, which was true for us. Yeah. I didn't think we would have, I mean, I knew what we wanted, but it turned out even better than we thought. Which doesn't mean everything's okay now, because it's not.
We'll get to that in a second. But part of the dynamic was also, you obviously have people like yourself there negotiating the entire time, but then you have these heads of state who are kind of coming in and coming out for like brief periods of time. Can you just reflect a little bit on like even how that worked? What was going on when you were trying to bring these people in?
So the French learned a lesson from Copenhagen, which is don't have all the leaders show up a day or two before the end on the theory that the thing's going to be all done then, because that might not happen. It didn't happen, as I've said, in Copenhagen, and you had the incredible experience of these leaders sitting at a table with nothing to approve, nothing, right? I mean, it had to be worked out then. So the French took from that the notion that we want the leaders, but they'll come the first day, not the last day. They'll come the first day, inject momentum into the process. They'll all get up and give short speeches in the big plenary hall, and then they'd get out of town. And that was actually exactly the right way to do it. And Obama had played a huge role personally in getting Copenhagen done. And the picture on the cover of my book is of, and we won't go back into this because we don't have time, but an amazing meeting toward the end where Obama, unannounced, crashed a meeting of China, India, Brazil, and South Africa to the astonished stares of the sort of jaw-dropping stares of his counterparts in those other countries. But the French did not want anything like that going on, and so they had people come. They had the leaders come first, and that worked. And Obama was there. Obama had 3 side meetings. He gave very good remarks, as he always did. He met separately with Xi Jinping. He met separately with Modi, India. And he met separately with a group of about 10 island states that we pulled together as a very deliberate signal to the islands and the vulnerable countries that the U.S. was with you, we're on your side, we're going to get this done together. Hugely important. Yeah. And Obama, of course, was great. I mean, they just, but the island leaders, I mean, I was in that meeting, and they were just so struck and I think touched by the fact that 3 meetings, China, India, and them, and so that was great. And I was then really glad to see all the leaders leave, because we had a lot of work to do. And as negotiators, and I was the so-called special envoy for the United States, and you couldn't kind of get anything done with leaders wandering around, right? Because they're the people who you want to be negotiating with are running after their leaders. So they had to get out of town. They did, and then we got down to work. And even though, again, I thought it was going to get done and all of that, we were, the thing that was, in some sense, the most important about that U.S.-China deal, and the thing that once I thought it through really attracted me to the idea, was that if that announcement happened, then China would need to have a success in Paris. And I think the Chinese posture in general was, we'd like to have a success. If it's not a success, as long as nobody blames us, that's okay. We don't care that much. And that was definitely their view in if you go all the way back to Copenhagen. But having had their leader walk down the aisle in the Great Hall of the People, red carpet, the whole works, and the front page of every newspaper, all over the world, China had a stake. They had to get this thing done. So I met with my Chinese counterpart 9 times in the period of that conference, and it wasn't till midnight on Wednesday, 2 days before the end, that we sat down and ironed out the things where we hadn't agreed up until then.
I have to ask, were you the one who told President Obama that it was time to leave, or was that fall on someone else?
No.
You didn't have to do that yourself. That's good.
But it was funny though, because so we met with the Chinese, and then there's some time before the meeting with Modi. And there's a holding room for the president and senior people, and I'm in the holding room, and all of a sudden I notice that Obama's not there now, and I see him out in the hallway in this back and forth with the kind of interesting but somewhat aggravating minister from India. And I was thinking, this guy, and he had a look on his face like the Indian minister, like a kid in a candy store, because here he is sparring with the President of the United States, and I'm thinking, like, so what's going on here is Obama wishes he was more in the action, like he wasn't.
He
liked the fact that he saved the day in Copenhagen, and now he didn't have enough of a role. So, but no, Obama was great.
Last question, as you hinted to, is there a movie coming out of this? Is there
not a movie, not a movie, but this is true. This is actually true, and I didn't know about this till a little while ago, but there is a play that was put on in the fall in London, in Stratford-on-Avon, done by the Royal Shakespeare Company, called Kyoto, written by these two young playwrights who've been a writing team for some time, and it was a complete hit. And it closed in December, and they brought it back to London. I'm going on, I have tickets on March 6th in London to see it, along with a bunch of
Do you know who's portraying
friends.
You?
Nobody portraying me in Kyoto, but the thing that's interesting is these guys want to do a trilogy. So Kyoto, then Copenhagen, then Paris. So they're all excited to meet with me. I've sent them copies of my book, and so. Not the movies, but pretty good.
Yeah.
And I don't know if nobody would have played me in in Kyoto, because I didn't have any role there. But I don't know how they're going to set it up. But it'd be hard not to
Who would you
have me
pick?
in there.
Who would you want to be? What actor?
George Clooney.
That's a good pick. All right. Now I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to actually ask an impolite question.
Sure.
I'm going to play the cynic. Okay. So the countries get together every year for these COPs. They talk big platitudes. They're negotiating big contracts or big negotiations.
Agreements.
We are still seeing increases in greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
The targets that have been set by most countries have not been met. Our goal of 1.5 degrees looks like probably not going to happen, even in the best of circumstances.
Right.
Hope now is for 2 degrees, that we can, keep global warming less than that. Why is this important? Why was Paris important at the end of the day?
So, look, Paris so far, I would say, has been a mixed bag. There have been a lot of good things that have happened, and there have been the things that you've talked about that haven't happened yet. So you need to step back in the first instance and say, could the world, climate change affects everybody, right? This is not just 10 or 20 countries, it affects everybody. If you imagine the world with no international agreement, everybody just acting or not acting on their own, no pledges, no targets, no nothing, would we be better off than we are now? The answer is radically not, right? And could you do this and say, like, well, why don't you just take the G20, take the big countries, you're the big players, it's 80% of emissions, just that's easier to deal with. In some respects, that's very kind of tempting, but the multilateralism in a case like this is really important. This is the only way countries below that group of 20 get any kind of seat at the table, and a lot of them are at more risk than anybody else, and at risk of harm. But also they've got to also be developing low carbon economies and so forth. So you have to have something. Paris was built on a kind of bottom-up basis where the targets, the term of art within the agreement is nationally determined contributions, which is blah blah blah. But what that means is countries make their own decisions about what they're going to do, but with goals in mind and with there are goals laid out in the Paris Agreement with respect to temperature. It's actually, the literal language there is well below 2 degrees and basically best efforts for 1.5. And then there's also a goal for emissions to be, more mumbo-jumbo diplomatic language, but basically meant to say emissions are net zero sometime in proximity to 2050. What has happened since Paris is, again, is mixed. I mean, the first thing that there's a very good sort of think tank in London put out a report a few years ago saying the Paris effect, called the Paris effect, and kind of detailing the enormous amount of investment and activity in the real economy that was spurred by Paris. Mm-hmm. The fact that Paris got done was a message that went out all over the world to countries, to citizens, to boardrooms, that, oh my God, after 25 years, the leaders of the world actually mean to do this. And so, and if you look at the progress of the green transition, of clean energy in all various forms, wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps and on and on and on, absolutely spectacular in the last 10 years. I mean, nobody in your business school or anywhere else would have been predicting. Or
I was actually, but that's what I study. But that's
okay. But the International Energy Agency, which is like a sort of gold standard for these kinds of things, we're so radically far off. I mean, if people thought it was going to go like this, it's gone like this. So that's incredibly important with respect to our capacity to contain climate change. I guess what I would say right now, broadly speaking, sort of stepping back, like what does the climate landscape look like to me? I would say first that the impacts and the bad things happening on account of climate change, impacts in science, think of it that way, faster and worse than anybody predicted, right? Faster and worse, more serious and happening faster than the best scientists thought. Technology, just what I said, happening at a spectacular rate. I think that if you took away part 3, which is the obstacles to action, I would say we could probably sort of get where we need to be by the early 2050s because it's going that fast. And the stuff that isn't figured out yet, how do you make green steel? How do you make green cement? Boy, there is tremendous amount of startup activity, investor activity all over the world, just intense. The obstacles, though, are most importantly the fossil fuel industry, which doesn't want to go anywhere. They want to keep doing what they're doing. They tell themselves that they can do it and it's not a problem, which is crazy. So you have that, but so it's partly what they're doing, but it's also the clout that they have in governments all over the world. So you have not as much action in terms of the pledges that are made, but also even when you make the pledges, not as much action in terms of follow-through as there should be. If you look at emissions, they're definitely going down compared to where they were. They're getting not too far away from a peak in the world. China has pretty much peaked its emissions. That's a lot better than it would have been otherwise, but it needs to be moving way down, and that's not happening yet. So yeah, Paris is, and I guess the other thing I would say is that you can never look at what's happening and just say, oh, well, Paris is failing, or this is Paris's fault. Paris is built on this, as I said, this bottom-up, nationally determined structure, without which there would have been no agreement. I mean, if the theory of the case or the agreement, and this is what a lot of people who sort of weren't savvy about the realities of negotiations wanted to say, Just figure out where the emissions need to be, and then divide them up among all the countries. Okay, you try that, right? In a world where everybody's got to say yes. So you've got to. I mean, it's the art of the possible.
Yeah. I want to encourage people to have their questions. If they have questions, to start to write those, and we can feed them to me. All right, now we're going to do the moment which I'm sure the audience was waiting for.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward to today. And you know, we have a new president, if you haven't heard, and there's been some changes in policy. I will comment, there's a great comment I feel that you had in the book. Obviously the book was written before you knew the outcome of the election here, but that we have been down this road before. 2016, we pull out of the Paris Accords. Biden administration, we go back in. And I thought what was interesting was the idea of having the long view, that the negotiations and the global community coming together to talk about climate change, that work continues regardless if the U.S. is kind of in or out officially. Clearly, it's better when the U.S. is playing a leadership role.
Right.
Reflect on where do you think this goes over the current administration, the next few years, what happens at the international level, at the negotiation level?
So I would agree with what you just said. I mean, obviously it's happened before. It's extraordinarily disappointing to countries. Things happen in a positive way in the context of the negotiations and in the context of real economy, work on clean energy. It happens much better when the U.S. is in and when the U.S. is going full speed ahead and is a player. And countries will be disappointed, angry, all of that, but they won't drop out. So the Paris regime will continue to happen. There are important things that are supposed to happen. There's one of these conferences still every year. The one this year is going to be in Brazil. It's going to focus on two important things. This year there are two 5-year cycles built into Paris. One is every 5 years, countries are supposed to re-up and improve upon what they've agreed to do before, and to act kind of at their highest level of engagement. There's also an every 5 year, different 5 years, but an every 5-year cycle that looks at the world as a whole. How are we doing? So this year you've got that is a year for countries to re-up what they're going to do. President Biden actually put forward what he was intending to do, understanding this happened in January. So we knew that Trump was coming in, but the U.S. had in fact developed this target, and they did the right thing. I mean, actually, a couple of people asked me about it, and I thought definitely put it forward. We know that Trump's not going to do it, but it's good to see what the U.S. was at least prepared to do. So you've got that, and you've also got, there's an issue of climate finance, which has to do with assistance mostly to poor and developing countries. And that is a very key issue this year. And so that's going to go on. It would go on better. It would work better if the U.S. was part of it, but it will go on. The work done at the level of innovation on all of those, to get not just some elements of the economy green, but kind of all elements, that's going to go on like gangbusters, I think. I mean, where it will be damaged, and this matters, everything matters, but where it will be hurt in the United States is that it won't have policy pushing in the same direction. So Biden's biggest and most important, in fact, the most important climate legislation ever in the United States is something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not really about inflation. It's much more about climate change. But that's huge and important legislation. It has led to something like $450 billion of investment all over the country, and more in red states than blue states, quite deliberately. So those kinds of things, and even just like a small example, there's a $7,500 credit for people who buy electric vehicles, right? All of that stuff is going to get well, not all of it actually, but some of that's going to get knocked down by Trump, and he's certainly not going to do anything. They're not going to try to come up with anything positive. I mean, Trump made it perfectly clear. Again, this is no surprise to anybody given his history, but he made very clear in that first week of an intense flurry of executive orders and other actions that he had no truck with clean energy. He was a fossil fuel guy. The more coal, the more oil, the more gas, the better. And so you'll have all of that action going on in companies trying to be green. You will have car companies, including in the U.S., absolutely trying to make the best electric vehicles possible, because if they just sort of thought, well, Trump doesn't care if we do it or not, they'll get killed internationally. They'll lose their market share. They'll lose any chance of having a good market share. So that action is going to keep going on, but it's just weakened. And the thing about the long game, you're right you're right in general, except there's one big problem, which is that this is a race against time. We are absolutely moving in the right direction. We will overall, net, be moving in the right direction, even under Trump, just not as fast. But the problem is the right direction is not good enough. We are definitely not going to get 1.5, and I think it's the closest we can get to 1.5, or at least to being on the safe side of 2, is really important. And the more you put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the more you don't, to use the wrong metaphor, put your foot on the pedal of green energy, the worse it is. So, but it's not going to be over. It's not going to end. It's not going to end in the United States. And by the way, there's going to be tons of action at state and local levels, cities, states. There's a group that was put together in 2017, right after Trump announced that he was withdrawing. It's called the U.S. Climate Alliance. It's the governors of basically all the states that have Democratic governors. Occasionally there are one or two moderate Republicans who are going to be pushing forward. So it'll be a mixed bag, but it hurts, but it's not going to kill things.
One of the questions here talks about the China conundrum, and to take a little deeper dive on that, as we talked about before, since Paris, massive change in a couple key industries here: vehicles, transportation, renewable energy, and the like. And simultaneously, we've seen this rise of China. When you look at things like battery technology, they're just dominating the supply chain everywhere, from rare earth metals to the processing of lithium to the creation of the batteries themselves. And then simultaneously, you have this decoupling, as people have referred to it, between the U.S. and China, and a greater animosity and even fear of conflict between the two countries. You then have the U.S. looking currently to be pulling back from a green transition in some way. And again, this is an area that I study, and I worry, are we doubling down on Blockbuster in the age of Netflix here? That we're going to be driving around like Cuba in our 1950s Buicks, where the rest of the world is driving their EVs. And just to put some numbers on this, Northern Europe, Sweden and Norway in particular, over 90% of new vehicle sales are EVs. China, over 50% of new vehicle sales are EVs. The world is transitioning. We're actually a laggard in EV adoption compared to most of the other industrialized parts of the world. How does this play out in negotiations, given that it's not just a question of obviously trying to solve climate change? There is economic impacts and winners and losers being created in this transition at this point.
So the most important thing that the United States could do purely in terms of economics is to go full speed ahead on the transition, because this is going to be, this is one of the great games of the 21st century, is the shift from fossil fuels to renewables. It's happening, it's going to happen. The more the U.S. hangs back, the more that Trump puts on his hard hat and pretends he's a coal miner. That doesn't help. But let me address the China question, because it's a very interesting one. And this isn't just a Trump thing. The Biden administration So here's the underlying facts about China, which it's sort of the good news and the bad news. Good news is that China, recognizing that it still its emissions are way, way, way too large and still relies too much on coal, is also by far the world leader in green energy. And in the whole, what they call supply chain, so from critical minerals and materials all the way up to the actual solar panel or the actual windmill or the actual vehicle, whatever. So from soup to nuts, China has an enormous lead on everybody else. And they have such an impressive capacity to manufacture and to put things together that China probably could produce all the green energy, all the green materials and all the green products that the world needs literally could all be produced in China. Okay, so what's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with that picture is you make yourself unbelievably dependent on China. And China has demonstrated over and over again that it is all too willing to use economic coercion if anybody crosses it. So, and if you don't imagine what this can look like, just look at what happened in Europe with respect to natural gas. Now, Europe lived on a lot of natural gas. Russia invades Ukraine. There's a backlash, and Russia cuts off the gas. And Europe has lost a lot of its capacity for energy. Then, they got supplies coming in from the U.S. and the Middle East and whatnot, but it was a perfect lesson, if you needed one, about not making yourself dependent, particularly on something as important as energy. So that led the U.S., and it's led the Europeans also, and Australia and Japan and others, to say we've got to start taking action to pull some of this supply chain into our countries or into friendly countries, and mining, for the right materials and so forth. So all of this is going on at the same time that it can't go on like overnight, because it takes time to build up the capacity to do these things. So you've got to buy a lot from China, but you've got to try to move away from China at the same time. So that's the way the Biden administration saw it. And then frankly, I'm completely devoted to dealing with climate change, but I think that it would be a mistake to just rely entirely on China. It would also be a mistake to not recognize that we need to work together with China on dealing with climate change, because we're still the two 800-pound gorillas. And again, that won't happen for the next 4 years. But
another question here, bringing another country in that we haven't talked about, which is Russia. And I'm going to add to it Saudi Arabia as well. So we have these states that clearly their economies largely depend on fossil fuels, oil and gas. Historically, what role, if any, have they played in these negotiations, and what's going to be their role moving forward here?
Well, their role will be, interestingly, Russia didn't play that big a role for a long time. I think that in general, I think the big fossil fuel producers, and certainly that's Saudi Arabia and Russia, will be mostly not constructive. At this point, Russia not constructive for all sorts of reasons. At the same time, let's stipulate that Saudi Arabia would like to be pumping oil for a long time. But the more if you imagine a world where electric vehicles, by the way, Biden had a directive to get to the goal to get to 50% EVs sold in the U.S. by 2030, so soon. So let's just, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, imagine a world where most of the cars on the road are going to be electric vehicles, and most of the trucks are going to be non-polluting. They might be electric, or they might be other technologies. But so what is that going to do? One thing that's going to do is take away a lot of the demand. So you can keep making oil, pumping oil, but if you start to go, sort of sector by sector to eliminate the demand, that's probably the best way you're going to be able to move. But are you going to move against all sorts of efforts to hamstring and slow down, yeah, that's what I mean when I talk about the fossil fuel industry. I'm talking about the big companies, and I'm talking about the big countries.
It's interesting to note, though, with some of the proclamations that Trump has made in the last couple of weeks, the reaction of oil producers in the U.S. has been cautionary, because they're concerned if they start pumping a lot more oil, they're going to suppress the price of oil, and that doesn't do them well either. So the way markets respond might not be quite as simple as, you know, drill baby drill here.
That's true, but also, even to the extent that he would actually be able to sort of follow that drill baby drill nonsense, it just will set the U.S. back economically, so I mean that's one of the many challenges that we've already seen coming out of the new Trump administration. It's going to be extremely difficult.
So we have time for one more question, and there's a great one here it's really kind of the big question.
Okay.
What needs to happen to create real progress on climate change?
Yeah, so no, it's a perfectly good question. In a funny way, I think, so one thing that has to happen, obviously, is that all of that innovative energy that's happening in the U.S. and Silicon Valley, all over the place here and around the world, that's got to just like go full speed ahead. But in one way, you can think about the biggest impediment. So I said the oil industry, obviously, the oil and gas industry, huge, big impediment. But the other thing that's an impediment is hearts and minds. It's people caring about this enough and seeing it enough as the level of threat that it actually is in terms of there being a livable world in 20 or 30 or 40 years. We can see things happening right now. I mean, the things, as I said, the things that are happening right now are at a level way beyond what people had expected. So it's not that, don't worry, nothing will happen for 50 years. It's happening right now. It's just that you can get to a level of deterioration. And it's very easy to see why it's hard to get that level of buy-in among the public, because it feels like it's a little bit distant, even if you're looking out your window and seeing these huge storms and heat waves and whatnot. And you know, there are always things that are more immediate on that people, also even that governments have to deal with, that are looking them right in the face, and it's such a huge problem that it can be, I think, a little bit overwhelming for just sort of ordinary people not immersed in this. You've got all sorts of factors like that, and you know, sort of one way or another we'll muddle through. The thing is, we actually won't muddle through if we don't do this right. So it's a pretty existential issue, but I think, you know, just a couple quick anecdotes. I think about what was happening with respect to COVID when it first struck, and if anybody would have said before COVID happened that, what do you think the chances are that national leaders or leaders of cities would say overnight that this city of 10 million people, done, shut down. Everybody stays home, and it's just a shut down city. People would have thought you were crazy. Of course you can't do that. There's the economy, there's jobs, you must be out of your mind. Until they did do it, because they had to do it. So I always think that the way we should be thinking about this is kind of, we can't do this, well, but compared to what? Mm-hmm. And when it was compared to the very real possibility of a plague raging through cities, oh, okay, then we can do it. So that's one thing. I guess the other thing I would just, a more positive note to end on, I guess, is to think about the difference that mass attention and mass action by people can have. And I go back to 1970, Earth Day, first Earth Day, which was the brainchild of a Senator, Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin. And there was an environmental consciousness that was already building up in the United States. There was a famous book called Silent Spring in 1962 by Rachel Carson, and there were reports about how the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught on fire because it was so polluted. So people were starting to get, and so that's what Nelson thought. And he thought that this was a decade of such, the 60s was a decade of such student and young people, activism for the Vietnam, regard to the Vietnam War and civil rights and women's rights and so forth. Maybe he could tap into that to get people to focus on climate change. So he works with his team to put together Earth Day, and 20 million people came out. And in short order, you had the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passing of the Clean Air Act, the passing of the Clean Water Act, and then a whole bunch of other things in the 1970s. But right away, those things happened under the presidency of that notorious liberal, Richard Nixon. That's because 20 million people were in the street. Yeah. So we're not anywhere near there yet, but something more like that. Sort of, what do you have to do? I think you've got to change hearts and minds, and you got to do all the technology stuff, and you got to just keep on working.
Well, thank you for that. That's very inspiring. Let's give a round of applause to Todd. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And again, I highly recommend the book, Landing the Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Great. Really enjoyed it.